The smell of freshly cut grass and sizzling hot dogs hung in the warm July air. It was our first 4th of July barbecue without my husband Frank, and I was trying my best to keep his traditions alive. I was handing a plate to our neighbor, Mr. Henderson, when I overheard my son-in-law, Marcus, talking near the rose garden Frank had spent 30 years perfecting. "Oh, absolutely," Marcus said, his voice slick with the confidence of a man who'd never had dirt under his fingernails. "A property like this in this market, it's a wasted asset. We're exploring options to finally modernize this lot. Time for a refresh." He gestured dismissively at the crimson roses, the ones Frank called our little soldiers. A wasted asset. The hot dog in my hand suddenly felt heavy, tasteless. My home, the place where my husband and I had built a life, raised our daughter, and weathered every storm, was just an asset to be modernized. Marcus looked over at me then and gave me a brilliant, empty smile, as if he'd just delivered the best news in the world. I smiled back, the way you do when you don't want to make a scene in front of the neighbors, but that smile was a lie. The explosion of a family, the fight for my home, the battle for my own dignity. It didn't start with a bang. It started right there, with a casual betrayal nestled between the Pledge of Allegiance and the potato salad. To understand how we reached that breaking point, you have to go back to the day the silence in my house became louder than any scream. It was about a year after we buried my husband, Frank. Grief is a funny thing. For months, it's a roaring monster that takes up all the air in the room. Then, one day, it settles. It doesn't leave, not really. It just becomes a quiet, heavy dust that coats every surface of your life. After the barbecue guests had left and the last of the plastic cups were in the recycling bin, that silence was deafening. The lingering smell of charcoal and citronella couldn't cover the scent I missed most, Frank's Old Spice and the faint, papery smell of the history books he was always reading. I walked through the living room, my fingers tracing the rim of the armchair where he used to sit. The fabric was worn smooth in the exact shape of his shoulders. For a moment, I could almost see the indentation, as if he'd just gotten up to get a glass of water. This house wasn't just a collection of rooms. It was a living scrapbook of our 45 years together. Every floorboard had a story. The one near the kitchen that always creaked was where our daughter, Jessica, took her first steps and fell, chipping her front tooth. The faint water stain on the ceiling in the hallway was from the time Frank tried to fix a leaky pipe himself after a week of watching DIY videos, flooding the bathroom and half the upstairs. We'd laughed until we cried that day, mopping up the water with every towel we owned. Now, the stain was just a pale ghost of a memory only I could see. I found myself in the doorway of his study, a room I hadn't touched. His reading glasses were still on top of a half-finished crossword puzzle on his desk. 17 down. A 5-letter word for a life's work. He'd filled in LOVE. I smiled, a small, aching thing. He always was a romantic. My gaze drifted to the walls. They were a soft, misty gray. I remembered the day we painted them, just a week after we'd signed the papers. The memory came back so clearly it felt like yesterday. We were in our late 20s, and we'd poured our entire life savings into the down payment for this house. It was a wreck, a fixer-upper the realtor had kindly called a diamond in the rough. Frank stood in the middle of the empty room, a paint roller in his hand, a streak of gray on his cheek. An old Sam Cooke song was crackling from a portable radio in the corner. I was on a stepladder, trying to cut in the edges near the ceiling, my arm aching. "Think we bit off more than we can chew, El?" he'd asked, a worried crinkle between his brows. I remember looking down at him, at his hopeful, tired eyes, and feeling a surge of love so powerful it almost knocked me off the ladder. I shook my head. "No," I said, my voice full of a certainty I didn't entirely feel. "It's perfect." He came over and steadied the ladder, his hand warm on my ankle. "This isn't just a house, El," he said, his voice soft but firm, as if he were stating a historical fact. "It's our story. We just have to write it." I came back to the present, my hand resting on that same gray wall. The paint was faded now, chipped in a few places, but it was still there, our story. But what happens when one of the authors is gone? Do you just stop writing? My daughter, Jessica, seemed to think so. I loved her more than anything, but lately, it felt like we were reading from different books. When she was a little girl, she used to say this house was a magical castle. Now, when she visited with Marcus, her eyes would scan the old wallpaper and the scuffed baseboards with a look I couldn't quite place. It wasn't nostalgia, it was evaluation, like a developer sizing up a plot of land. Marcus called it good bones. A house with good bones was a house you could tear down to the studs and rebuild into something else entirely, something modern, something that wasn't coated in the stubborn dust of memory. I suppose that's why his comment at the barbecue had cut so deep. A wasted asset. He wasn't just talking about the property value. He was talking about my life, my story with Frank. He saw it all as something old and inefficient, something that needed to be gutted and refreshed. I walked into the kitchen and picked up one of the old, chipped mugs he and Jessica wanted to throw away. It was a cheap souvenir from a trip to the Grand Canyon in '98. The handle had been glued back on twice. It was worthless. And it was priceless. I filled it with water and stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the rose garden shrouded in twilight. Frank's roses, our little soldiers. They looked darker in the fading light, like they were standing guard. Guarding what, I wondered? A house? A memory? Or just a lonely old woman who was starting to feel like a ghost in her own home? The weight of it all, the upkeep, the taxes, the sheer size of the lonely quiet pressed down on me. For a fleeting second, a traitorous thought whispered through my mind. Maybe they're right. Maybe it is too much. But then I looked at those roses, standing so straight and proud in the dark, and I knew, you don't abandon your story just because it's gotten harder to read. You hold it closer. I thought that quiet resolution, made in the twilight of my own kitchen, would be a kind of armor. But I soon learned that some people don't want to read your story. They want to edit it, to cross out the sentences they don't like, and to write their own ending. The polite invasion began the following Saturday. They didn't call first. The doorbell rang at 9 a.m., a time when the house was usually still steeped in the peaceful quiet of my morning routine with a book and a cup of tea. But there they were on my doorstep, my daughter Jessica and her husband Marcus, holding a cardboard tray of coffees and beaming with an aggressive, well-rested cheerfulness. "We're here to help, Mom," Jessica announced, kissing the air near my cheek as she breezed past me. "Operation Declutter is a go." Before I could protest, she was in the kitchen, her expensive handbag landing on the counter with a thud. Marcus followed, placing a large, steaming latte in front of me. "Top of the morning, Eleanor," he said. "We figured we could help you get a handle on a few things. Lighten the load." He spoke in the same tone he used for his business presentations, smooth, persuasive, and utterly devoid of genuine warmth. It was the language of a friendly takeover. Jessica had already opened my kitchen cabinets. "Okay, first things first," she said, pulling out the stack of mismatched mugs I'd collected over 40 years. "We are getting you a proper, matching set. It's about creating a sense of calm and order." She began sorting them into 2 piles on the counter. The sleek, minimalist mugs she'd given me for Christmas last year went into 1 pile. Everything else, the chipped, the faded, the hopelessly sentimental, went into the other. She picked up the mug from our Grand Canyon trip, the one with the handle Frank had painstakingly glued back on. "Honestly, Mom, this one has to go," she said with a little laugh, as if we were sharing a joke. I felt a tightening in my chest. "That one was your father's favorite," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "He said the coffee always tasted better in it." Jessica's smile faltered for just a second. "I know, but memories are in your heart, not in old ceramics. It's just stuff, and letting go of stuff is liberating." It was a line I was sure she'd read on a blog somewhere. She tossed it into a large cardboard box she'd brought, which already had "Donate" written on the side in thick black marker. The clink of the mug hitting the bottom of the box sounded like a tiny crack in my foundation. One by one, my memories followed. A dented saucepan Frank used for his famous chili on Super Bowl Sunday. A stack of recipes my own mother had clipped from newspapers, their edges yellowed and brittle. Each item she discarded was a paragraph of my life, deemed unnecessary by a ruthless editor. I didn't fight. What could I say? How do you explain that a dented pot holds the phantom smell of cumin and laughter? How do you argue that a stained recipe card is a tangible link to a hand that has long since vanished? To argue would have made me seem like a foolish old woman clinging to junk. So I sat at my kitchen table, sipping the too hot, too bitter coffee Marcus had brought, and watched my daughter cheerfully pack my life into a box. 2 hours later, just as I thought the assault was over, the doorbell rang again. Marcus answered it with a familiarity that grated on my nerves. "Chad, hey man, thanks for stopping by," he boomed. A tall, thin man in fashionable glasses and expensive-looking sneakers stepped inside. He wasn't a friend, he was an architect. I knew it instantly from the way his eyes scanned the crown molding and the structure of the doorways, not the photos on the wall. "Eleanor, this is my friend Chad," Marcus said, draping an arm over the man's shoulder. "He's one of the best residential architects in the city." I was telling him about this place and he was intrigued, wanted to see the classic craftsman layout for himself. It was such a smooth, effortless lie. I felt like a museum piece in my own home as they walked from room to room. I followed them, a silent ghost trailing in their wake. Chad would tap a wall with his knuckles, a thoughtful look on his face. "This is lath and plaster, for sure," he'd murmur. "But this isn't a load-bearing wall. You could open this whole space up, create a sightline straight through to the backyard. Amazing for entertaining." My heart clenched. That was the wall where I had marked Jessica's height every year on her birthday, from the time she was a toddler until the day she left for college. The pencil marks were still there, faint but visible if you knew where to look. Frank had sealed them with a thin layer of varnish to preserve them. To Chad, it was just an obstacle, an inefficiency. "And the kitchen could be phenomenal," Chad continued, striding back into the room Jessica had just sterilized. "Blow out this wall, put in a massive island, waterfall countertops. It would completely change the energy of the home." "That's exactly what I was thinking," Marcus agreed eagerly, his eyes gleaming. "We're just blue sky thinking, Eleanor, just getting a sense of the potential." Jessica chimed in, her voice full of sweet reason. "Don't you want a home that's easier to navigate, Mom? Less to worry about? Think how much more light you'd have." They were talking about light, but all I felt was a creeping darkness. They weren't seeing my home. They were seeing a project, a shell. They were standing in the heart of my story, discussing how to rip out all the pages. When they finally left, the donate box sat by the front door like an accusation. The house felt strangely cold, violated. I walked over to the box and reached inside, my fingers closing around the familiar, twice-repaired handle of the Grand Canyon mug. I pulled it out and held it in my hands, a tiny piece of salvage from a shipwreck. This wasn't about helping me, this was about erasing me. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that they were just getting started. I just underestimated their strategy. Erasure wasn't just about throwing things away in a cardboard box. It was about making me doubt the very ground I stood on, about convincing me to erase myself. The next phase of the campaign arrived in a series of sleek, white boxes from Amazon. Marcus showed up one afternoon, looking like a tech evangelist here to save a heathen soul. "Got a little surprise for you, Eleanor," he announced. "We're going to future-proof this place, create an ecosystem for your safety and our peace of mind." For the next 3 hours, my home, once a sanctuary of quiet and memory, was filled with the whine of a power drill and the sharp scent of plastic. He installed a video doorbell, replacing the old brass one Frank had polished every spring. He placed smart speakers in the kitchen and living room, like little black spies on my countertops. The worst was the small, orb-like camera he mounted in the corner of the hallway, the one that gave a clear view of the front door, the stairs, and the entrance to Frank's study. "Don't you worry your head about the tech," he said, tapping on his phone with his thumb. "It's all connected to an app on my phone and Jessica's. If you ever fall or need anything, we'll know instantly. We can even check in and say hi." He demonstrated by walking into the kitchen. A moment later, his voice, tinny and disembodied, filled the hallway from the speaker on the bookshelf. "See, Eleanor? I'm right here with you." I felt a jolt of shock, my hand flying to my chest. It didn't feel like he was with me. It felt like he was haunting me. The warm, familiar spaces of my house now felt different, observed. The little black camera in the hall had a single, blue, unblinking light. It watched me as I walked from room to room, a constant, silent judgment. A few days later, Jessica called, her voice a perfect blend of casualness and concern. "Hey Mom, quick question. Did you get a letter from the Homeowners Association this week?" I was in the backyard, tending to Frank's roses. "No, I don't think so," I said, snipping a withered bloom. I always get the mail right at noon. Why? Oh, it's probably nothing, she said, a little too quickly. Marcus was just chatting with someone on the board, and they mentioned a complaint about overgrowth? Something about the roses violating community standards. I stopped, the pruning shears still in my hand. I looked at the garden, at the neatly mulched beds, and the carefully staked rose bushes. Frank's little soldiers. They were my pride and joy, a living testament to his love. That can't be right, I said. Brenda from down the street is the head of the HOA. She was just admiring these last week. Well, maybe it was a mistake, Jessica said smoothly. Don't worry about it, Mom. Marcus will handle it. We just don't want you getting fined. After we hung up, I stood there for a long time. It felt wrong. A librarian's mind is trained to spot inconsistencies, to check the sources. So I did. I washed my hands, went inside, and called Brenda. She was delighted to hear from me. We chatted about her grandkids, about the upcoming neighborhood potluck. Then, I asked, Brenda, this is a silly question, but has the HOA received any complaints about my garden lately? There was a pause. Your garden, she said, and then she laughed, a full, genuine sound. Eleanor, your garden is the standard we hold everyone else to. Of course not. Why would you even ask that? Just checking, I said, keeping my voice light. Thanks, Brenda. I hung up the phone, and the blue, watchful eye of the camera in the hallway seemed to mock me. They had lied. It wasn't a mistake or a miscommunication. It was a fabrication, a tiny, perfectly crafted crack they were trying to place in my reality. I didn't confront them. I just filed the information away, a librarian cataloging a very dangerous piece of fiction. The main event came the following Tuesday. My phone rang, and it was Jessica, her voice frantic with worry. Mom, oh thank goodness, I was so worried. I waited at the daily grind for over an hour. Are you okay? You completely forgot about our lunch. I was sitting in Frank's armchair, a book open in my lap. I looked over at the large wall calendar in the kitchen, a habit of a lifetime. Every appointment, every birthday, was written there in my neat block print. Tuesday was blank, except for trash day. Jessica, honey, I think you're mistaken, I said gently. We didn't have plans for lunch today. What? Her voice was laced with a pained disbelief. Mom, we talked about it on Sunday. You said you were craving their tomato soup. I even texted you a confirmation this morning. I never got a text. I knew I never got a text. My phone was right beside me. I don't have a text from you, dear, I said, my own certainty beginning to feel like a flimsy shield. There was a heavy sigh on the other end of the line. Oh, Mom, she said, her voice now dripping with a sad, gentle pity that was worse than any anger. You've just been so scattered lately. It's okay, really. It happens. Don't worry about it. We just worry about you, being here all alone. When I hung up the phone, the room began to feel unstable. I stood up and walked to the calendar, my fingers tracing the empty white square for Tuesday. Could I have forgotten? Could I have imagined the conversation on Sunday, deleted the text without realizing it? A cold wave of fear washed over me. It was the deepest, most primal fear of aging. The fear that your own mind is betraying you. I sank onto a kitchen chair, my head in my hands. The smart speaker on the counter sat there silently. The camera in the hall kept its vigil. My house, my scrapbook, my story, it was being rewritten, and the main character, me, was being edited into a forgetful, incompetent old woman. But then, through the fog of doubt, the librarian in me surfaced. I thought of the evidence, the donate box, the lie about the HOA, and now, the lunch that never was. It wasn't a random series of events. It was a pattern, a campaign. I lifted my head and looked straight down the hall at the unblinking blue eye of the camera. They didn't think I was losing my mind. They were trying to convince me I was. They weren't worried about me. They were building a case against me. And in that moment, the grief and the fear receded, replaced by something else. A cold, quiet, and utterly resolute clarity. I was no longer a grieving widow, waiting for the story to end. I was a librarian who had just discovered the lie at the heart of the book, and I would not stop until I found the truth. I thought finding it would be a matter of quiet observation, of gathering facts like I used to gather books for a research paper. I was prepared for a chess match, a slow, strategic game. I was not prepared for them to flip the board over. The invitation came that Friday. Jessica called, her voice bright and brittle, insisting I come over for Sunday dinner. "Just the three of us," she'd said. "A real family meal. I'm making your favorite pot roast." It was the same meal I'd made every Sunday for the first 10 years of her life. The use of it as bait was both clumsy and deeply insulting. I knew it was a trap, an ambush disguised as a dinner party. Every instinct told me to say no, to barricade myself inside my home, but the librarian in me, the part that needed to know the end of the story, couldn't resist. Sometimes, the only way to understand the monster is to walk straight into its den. Their house was the architectural opposite of mine. Where my home was warm wood, cluttered bookshelves, and soft, worn fabrics, theirs was a landscape of cool gray, sharp angles, and polished chrome. It was less a home and more a showroom, a place where people didn't so much live as they performed a minimalist lifestyle. The air didn't smell like baking or old books, it smelled of a faint, citrus-scented cleaning product. Dinner was a masterclass in tension. The pot roast was technically perfect but tasted of nothing. The clinking of our silverware against the heavy ceramic plates was the only sound for long stretches. Marcus talked about synergy in the tech market, and Jessica described a friend's elaborate gender reveal party. It was all noise, a verbal smokescreen to hide the real purpose of the evening. I played my part, the quiet, agreeable mother, asking the right questions and nodding in the right places. I felt like an anthropologist studying a strange and hostile tribe. Finally, after Marcus had cleared the plates with brisk efficiency, it began. Jessica reached over and took my hand, her skin cool to the touch. Her expression was a carefully constructed mask of loving concern. "Mom," she began, her voice soft, "we need to talk. Marcus and we're worried. We're so worried about you." Marcus sat down opposite me, leaning forward with his elbows on the polished table, assuming the posture of a man about to close a difficult deal. "Eleanor," he said, forgoing the pretense of calling me Mom. "What we're about to say comes from a place of deep love and respect." From her designer handbag, Jessica pulled out a brochure, thick and glossy. She slid it across the table toward me. The cover was a picture of two silver-haired seniors, laughing as they played lawn bowls on a perfect emerald green lawn. The title, in a flowing gold script, read, "Golden Sunset Meadows, an active and engaged community for your next chapter." I stared at it. I didn't touch it. It felt like a snake lying on the table. "It's a wonderful place, Mom," Jessica continued, her words rushing out in a well-rehearsed torrent. "It's more like a resort than a retirement home. They have a pool, art classes, chef-prepared meals, and a 24-hour nursing staff. You'd be safe. You'd have friends your own age. You wouldn't have to worry about a thing." My internal monologue was screaming. "I'm not worried. I have friends. I am safe in my own home." But my lips remained a thin, straight line. Marcus took over, shifting from the emotional cell to the practical one. "And frankly, the finances of keeping up that old house just don't make sense anymore, Eleanor. The property taxes alone are astronomical. Then there's the heating, the inevitable roof repairs. It's a financial liability. This," he tapped the brochure with a manicured finger, "is a practical, all-inclusive solution." I finally picked up the brochure. The paper was heavy, expensive. The smiling faces inside looked like actors, their joy staged and hollow. This wasn't a home. It was a beautifully decorated waiting room. I placed it back on the table, aligning it perfectly with the edge. "You've put a lot of thought into this," I said, my voice unnaturally calm. Jessica beamed, mistaking my composure for compliance. We even went for a tour last week. And the best part is, we found the perfect little bungalow for you, one that overlooks the garden." Then came the final, brutal blow. "And because the wait list is so long, we went ahead and put down the deposit for you," Marcus said, delivering the line with the casual air of a man announcing he'd picked up milk from the store. "It's non-refundable, of course, so your spot is secured for the 1st of next month." The room fell silent. The air crackled. So this was it. Not a discussion, not a proposal. It was a verdict. I had been tried, judged, and sentenced without ever being called to the stand. I slowly folded my linen napkin, pressing the creases flat with my thumb. Once, twice, The small, deliberate movements were the only protest I had left. I looked at my daughter, searching her face for any flicker of the girl I had raised, the girl whose height I had marked on the wall in our hallway. I found none. There was only a stranger, her eyes shining with the righteousness of her betrayal. I had only one question. "And the house?" I asked, my voice a quiet whisper in the sterile room. "My home." Marcus leaned back, a triumphant smile playing on his lips. "Well, that's the other great part," he said smoothly. "We'll keep it in the family, of course. We'll handle everything. It's the only way to protect Frank's legacy." To protect Frank's legacy. The hypocrisy was so profound, so staggering, that it almost took my breath away. They were going to honor the man whose memory they were trying to demolish. I stood up then, my chair making a soft scraping sound against the floor. "Thank you for dinner," I said, my voice as polished and cold as their chrome fixtures. "I need to go home now." They didn't try to stop me. They had won. Or so they thought. I walked out into the cold night air, the glossy brochure clutched in my hand. The slow burn of the past few weeks, the small insults, the calculated lies, had finally ignited into a hard, cold flame. They had given me an ultimatum. They had declared war on my life, on my story. They had left me no choice. I would have to find my own weapon. But when I got home that night, driving on autopilot through the quiet suburban streets, the house felt less like a fortress and more like a tomb. The glossy brochure for Golden Sunset Meadows sat on the passenger seat, its cheerful, staged perfection a mockery of everything I was about to lose. What weapon does a 70-year-old librarian have against a slick corporate raider and her own daughter? They had logic, ambition, and the cold, hard currency of my supposed decline. I had memories. It felt like bringing a book of poetry to a gunfight. The next few days were a gray, formless fog. I'd wake up, make coffee in the Grand Canyon mug I'd rescued from the donate box, and just sit at the kitchen table, staring out at Frank's roses. The blue, unblinking eye of the camera in the hallway watched me. The smart speaker on the counter sat in silent judgment. I felt like a prisoner on death row, watching the clock tick down to the first of the month. My home, this living scrapbook of my life, had been given an eviction date. Every familiar creak of the floorboards, every slant of morning light on the worn oriental rug felt like a small, painful goodbye. I had avoided Frank's study since the funeral. It was the one room that was purely his, the epicenter of his quiet, thoughtful soul. To go in there felt like admitting, in a final, tangible way, that he was never coming back. But on a particularly bleak Wednesday afternoon, with the weight of the ultimatum pressing down so hard I could barely breathe, I found myself standing before its closed door. I needed a weapon, yes, but more than that, I needed my husband. And this was the only place he still truly existed. I turned the old brass knob and pushed the door open. A wave of his scent, old paper, leather, and the faint, sweet aroma of the pipe tobacco he only smoked on special occasions washed over me, and my knees felt weak. The room was just as he'd left it. A tower of books on the verge of collapse sat next to his favorite armchair. His tweed jacket was still draped over the back of his desk chair. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of afternoon light slanting through the window, illuminating a universe of stillness. For a long time I just stood there, letting the profound quiet of the room settle over me. Then, slowly, I began to move. I ran my fingers over the spines of his books, a library of a brilliant mind. Histories of the Roman Empire, biographies of obscure presidents, collections of military strategy. My fingers stopped on a thick, well-worn volume with a faded blue cover, a biography of Benjamin Franklin. It was one of Frank's favorites. He admired Franklin's ingenuity, his thrift, his belief that a life should be one of constant, humble improvement. I pulled the heavy book from the shelf, cradling it in my hands. It wasn't a search for answers. It was an act of communion, a way to touch something he had touched, to feel close to him one last time. I sank into his leather desk chair, the cool material sighing under my weight, and let the book fall open in my lap. As it opened, a small, folded piece of paper, yellowed with age, fluttered from between the pages and drifted to the floor like a single, pale leaf. I stared at it for a moment, my heart giving a strange little thump. I bent down and picked it up. The paper was brittle, and I unfolded it carefully. It was a note, written in Frank's familiar, neat academic script. My breath caught in my throat. L, it read. Remember our rainy day in Philadelphia? The key is where it began. B, F. That was it, just those few, cryptic words. Philadelphia. A flood of memory rushed back, so vivid it felt like I was there. It was 20 years ago, a trip for a history conference. A sudden thunderstorm had ambushed us, and we ducked into the nearest doorway to escape the downpour, laughing and soaked to the bone. It was a tiny, charmingly recreated colonial print shop, a working museum dedicated to Benjamin Franklin's first press. We spent the next hour there, the only visitors, watching a historian in period costume demonstrate how the old press worked. Frank had been completely captivated. It was one of those perfect, unplanned moments that become the cornerstones of a marriage. But what did it mean? The key is where it began. What key? My gaze fell to the initials at the bottom. B, F, Benjamin Franklin. Or Frank's own initials, Frank Vance, written backwards for some playful reason. My mind, sluggish with grief for so long, began to stir. The librarian in me, the part that organized, cataloged, and solved puzzles, slowly woke up. I read the note again, and again. It wasn't a sentimental keepsake. The tone was different. It was a message, a clue. Frank, the quiet, predictable history professor, had left me a puzzle. The sheer improbability of it was staggering. He wasn't a man for games or secrets, and yet here was one, tucked away in a book about a man famous for both his wisdom and his love of a good cipher. A spark, tiny but intensely bright, ignited in the cold, gray fog of my despair. I looked around the study. It was no longer a tomb. It was an archive, a research library. The dusty books weren't just the remnants of a life that was over. They were the primary sources for a mystery that was just beginning. The ultimatum from Jessica and Marcus, the cold dread of golden sunset meadows, it all receded for a moment, replaced by a single, sharp, and electrifying question. What had Frank been trying to tell me? I carefully folded the note and slipped it into my pocket. The brochure on the coffee table was their weapon, a declaration of my incompetence. This small, cryptic note, this felt like mine. They thought the story was over, the ending already written. But my husband, the historian, the man who knew better than anyone that the past is never truly past, had just handed me a secret chapter. And like any good librarian, I knew that the first step to understanding any text is to start with the research. The fog of despair had been replaced by the clarifying hum of a question, and my old instincts, dormant for so long, kicked in. Frank's study transformed from a place of grief into my new headquarters. I spent the next 2 days in a state of quiet, focused intensity I hadn't felt in years. I became an unseen observer in my own life, a spy behind enemy lines. By day, I played the part they had cast for me. When Jessica called to check in, her voice dripping with that cloying pity, I made sure to sound a little frail, a little confused. I'd ask her to repeat herself, pretend I couldn't find my reading glasses. I let her believe her campaign was working, that the walls of my mind were crumbling. Each conversation was a small, bitter performance, but it was necessary. It kept them satisfied. It kept them away. But when I hung up the phone, the fog would vanish. I was sharp, methodical. I pulled out the old, leather-bound photo albums from the hall closet, the ones documenting our life in neatly labeled sections. Summer vacation 1995, Jessica's graduation, trip to the East Coast. I found the section on Philadelphia. My hands, which had trembled with weakness just days before, were now steady as I turned the thick, black pages. There we were, younger versions of ourselves, smiling in front of the Liberty Bell, Frank making a goofy face while eating a cheesesteak. The memories were so sweet they ached. But I wasn't there for nostalgia. I was a researcher hunting for a primary source. I was looking for the print shop. I found it on the 3rd page. A slightly blurry photo of Frank and me huddled under a small green awning, rain plastering our hair to our faces. The sign above the door was barely legible. I went to Frank's desk and retrieved his old magnifying glass. I held it over the photo, my breath held tight in my chest. Franklin's Courtyard Printers, I whispered. It was a start, but it wasn't enough. The key is where it began. Did it begin at the print shop? It felt too literal for Frank. I gently slid the photo out of its plastic sleeve. And behind it, tucked away for 2 decades, was the answer. It wasn't just a brochure from the museum shop. It was the official program from the history conference Frank had been attending, the very reason we were in Philadelphia. My heart began to beat a little faster. The program was a simple, folded pamphlet listing the speakers and their topics. Frank's presentation, The Economics of Rebellion, Franklin's Financial Influence on the Continental Congress, was circled in his own neat ink. I almost missed it, but on the back cover, in small print, was a list of the conference's official sponsors. My librarian's eye, trained to scan for details, moved down the list of universities and historical societies. And then I saw it. The 4th name down. A simple, elegant logo with a key incorporated into the lettering. Franklin Trust, Preserving Legacies for Generations. The name hit me like a physical blow. Franklin, Trust, Legacies. It couldn't be a coincidence. This was it. This had to be it. Frank, the humble professor who drove a 10-year-old Ford and bought his suits on sale at Sears, had some connection to a high-end wealth management firm? It seemed impossible, but the note in my pocket felt like a warm, heavy stone. Now came the hardest part. I had a name, but what could I do with it? I couldn't just call and ask, did my late husband have a secret fortune? They'd think I was a lunatic, or worse, a scammer. I needed a strategy, a plausible reason for my inquiry. I needed a new identity. I sat at Frank's desk for an hour, rehearsing, planning. I would have to become someone else, someone professional, someone who belonged in their world. The next morning I took a deep breath and dialed the number from the program. I pitched my voice a little lower, a little more brisk. When a polite professional receptionist answered, I was ready. "Good morning," I said, my voice betraying none of the frantic pounding in my chest. "My name is Eleanor Vance. I'm a research associate assisting with the posthumous publication of the works of Professor Frank Vance. I'm calling from his personal archive." The lie felt surprisingly natural on my tongue. "Of course," the woman said. "How can I help you?" "We're in the process of compiling a complete financial bibliography for his estate, and our records are slightly incomplete. We have a note indicating a possible correspondence or account with your firm, Franklin Trust, dating back about 20 years. I was hoping you could simply confirm if Professor Vance was ever a client, just for our records." There was a pause, the soft clicking of a keyboard on the other end. I could hear my own pulse roaring in my ears. Each second felt like an hour. "Yes, I see him here," she said finally. "Professor Frank Vance. He was indeed a valued client." I gripped the edge of the desk. "He was a client?" I asked, emphasizing the past tense, fishing for more. "He was, and the account established under his trust is still actively managed," she replied smoothly, professionally. "Of course, all details are confidential and accessible only by the designated executor of the estate." "Of course," I echoed, my mind reeling. "An active account, a trust, an executor. And could you just confirm for our records who the designated executor is?" There was another, shorter pause. "According to our files, the sole executor listed for the Vance Trust is you, Mrs. Vance. Eleanor Vance." I thanked her for her time and hung up the phone. I sat in the stillness of Frank's study, the receiver still cold in my hand. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. It wasn't just a small investment he'd forgotten to mention. It was a trust. An active, managed account. And I was in charge of it. Me, the woman my daughter thought couldn't remember a lunch date, the woman my son-in-law thought was a liability in an old house. The full scope of it was terrifying and exhilarating. I still didn't know the details, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The weapon I had been looking for wasn't a poem, it was an arsenal, and I had just found the key. But a key is useless until you have the courage to turn the lock. The next 48 hours were a blur of quiet, calculated preparation. I told Jessica I was feeling under the weather, that I needed a few days to rest and process their generous offer. It was the perfect excuse. They wanted me to be weak, so I performed weakness. It gave me the space I needed to plan my next move. On Thursday morning, I took a train to the city. Watching the familiar suburbs of my life blur and give way to the steel and glass canyons of the financial district felt like crossing a border into another country. Franklin Trust was located on the 54th floor of a skyscraper that pierced the clouds. The lobby was a cathedral of marble and hushed reverence for money. As I gave my name to the receptionist, I felt a tremor of the old, insecure Eleanor, a retired librarian in her sensible shoes, completely out of her element. But then I touched the folded note from Frank in my pocket, and my spine straightened. I was not here as a guest. I was here as the executor. I was led into a corner office with a view that seemed to stretch across the entire state. The man who stood to greet me was named Arthur Davies. He was in his late 60s, with a kind face, a perfectly tailored suit, and the unmistakable air of old money. He treated me with a gentle, cautious deference, the way one might treat a fragile, grieving widow who had stumbled into a world she couldn't possibly understand. "Mrs. Vance," he said, shaking my hand warmly, "it is an honor to finally meet you. Your husband was a remarkable man." "He was a history professor, Mr. Davies," I replied, my voice steady. A small smile played on his lips. He gestured for me to sit in a plush leather chair opposite his enormous mahogany desk. "That," he said, sitting down and opening a thick leather-bound portfolio, "is a testament to his genius for understatement. Your husband wasn't just a history professor, Mrs. Vance. He was one of the most brilliant historical asset investors we have ever had the privilege of representing." He turned the portfolio around for me to see. It wasn't filled with stock certificates or bond statements. It was filled with photographs and authentication documents. Frank's academic knowledge gave him an edge no one else on Wall Street had, Mr. Davies explained. He knew which historical figures were about to have a renaissance, whose letters were undervalued. He bought a series of battlefield dispatches from a Revolutionary War general in the early 90s for what you'd pay for a used car. They are now worth more than your house. He acquired a first-draft manuscript from a major American novelist, one thought to be lost, from a dusty estate sale in Vermont. That alone is a 7-figure asset. Page after page, he detailed a secret empire built not on stocks, but on stories. My quiet, unassuming Frank, the man who would spend hours debating the nuances of the Stamp Act, had been quietly collecting the very pages of American history and turning them into a fortune. My mind struggled to comprehend it. I thought back to all the times we'd pinched pennies, the vacations we'd put off, the used cars we'd driven. It wasn't because we had to. It was because he was playing a long game, building a fortress for me brick by silent brick. Finally, Mr. Davies turned to the last page of the portfolio. It was a simple balance sheet. At the bottom was a single number, the net worth of the Vance Trust. The number was so large, with so many commas, that it seemed to float off the page. I felt the air leave my lungs. The entire world, the city skyline outside the window, the quiet ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, seemed to go silent. In that moment, I felt not joy, but a profound and aching grief for the man I had loved for 45 years and, I now realized, had never fully known. I must have been quiet for a long time, because Mr. Davies cleared his throat gently. "It's a lot to take in," he said softly. "But that's just the passive portfolio." Frank was also quite active in his later years. The trust holds a majority stake in a private equity firm called Argent Capital. They specialize in providing bridge loans and seed funding for ambitious young men with big ideas. He slid another thinner folder across the desk. Argent Capital has a number of clients, but there's one in particular I thought might be of interest to you, given your family connection. He opened the folder. The name on the top of the loan agreement was Innovate Dynamics. It meant nothing to me. The founder and CEO, Mr. Davies clarified, his eyes watching me carefully, is a Mr. Marcus Thorne. The name hit me not like a lightning bolt, but like a slow, cold poison spreading through my veins. Marcus, my son-in-law. According to their latest quarterly reports. Mr. Davies continued, his voice neutral. Innovate Dynamics is over-leveraged. They've missed 2 rounds of funding targets and are currently 90 days behind on their interest payments to Argent Capital. I stared at him, the pieces clicking into place with the force of a tectonic shift. The desperation, the sudden, urgent need to liquidate my wasted asset, the gaslighting. It wasn't just about greed, it was about survival, his survival. I felt a change in the room, in myself. I sat up a little straighter. The grief receded, replaced by a glacial calm. The librarian was gone. The executor was here. "So, let me be clear, Mr. Davies," I said, my voice as crisp as a new banknote. I am the sole executor of the Vance Trust. The trust holds a controlling interest in Argent Capital, and Argent Capital holds my son-in-law's debt. I paused, letting the weight of the words settle in the quiet, expensive air. Which means, for all intents and purposes, I am Marcus's banker. Mr. Davies's gentle, paternalistic smile vanished, replaced by a look of profound, undisguised respect. Yes, Mrs. Vance, he said, that is precisely what it means. That evening, I sat in my hotel room overlooking the glittering city lights. I was no longer the same woman who had arrived that morning. I was no longer a victim. I was a strategist. I took out my phone and dialed Jessica's number. The mask of the frail, confused mother slipped back on as easily as a comfortable old glove. Jessica. Honey, it's me, I said, my voice soft and a little shaky. I've been doing a lot of thinking since Sunday. And you're right. You and Marcus are right. The house is too much for me. It's for the best. I could hear the audible sigh of relief on the other end of the line, the sound of a predator hearing its prey finally surrender. Oh, Mom, I'm so glad you understand, she said. Let's just get it over with, I continued, letting a little weariness creep into my voice. Why don't we all meet at that lawyer's office you mentioned on Friday? We can sign all the papers to transfer the deed then. Of course, Mom, she said, her voice bright with victory. We'll handle everything. You won't have to worry about a thing. I know, I said softly, looking out at the endless city lights, each one a tiny spark in a vast, dark world. I'm counting on it. I hung up the phone. The trap was set. The board was arranged. They were walking into a meeting to finalize the takeover of my small, humble house. They had no idea they were about to face the woman who owned their entire world. As I walked into the soulless beige conference room of their lawyer's office, I arranged my face into the mask of gentle surrender they expected to see. The air smelled of stale coffee and industrial carpet cleaner. It was the perfect setting for an execution. Jessica and Marcus were already there, sitting on one side of a long, polished table that reflected the buzzing fluorescent lights above. They stood when I entered, their smiles wide and predatory. Jessica rushed to my side, taking my arm in a proprietary grip. Mom, you made it! Are you okay? Can I get you some water? It was a brilliant performance of filial concern. Marcus was practically vibrating with triumph. Eleanor, he said, pulling out a chair for me. Thanks for coming. We know this is hard, but honestly, it's the best decision for everyone. You'll see. I allowed myself to be seated. Their lawyer, a man named Mr. Gable with a weak chin and an expensive tie, gave me a brief, professionally sympathetic nod. I was the problem to be managed, the final box to be checked on their project plan. I said nothing. A librarian knows the power of silence. I let them fill it. Okay then, Mr. Gable said, clearing his throat. Let's get to it. He opened a thick file folder and slid a formidable stack of papers to the center of the table. Eleanor, this is the standard deed transfer agreement. It signs the property at 128 Oak Street over to Jessica and Marcus Thorne. I've highlighted the signature lines for you in yellow. We can walk through it page by page if you like. He spoke slowly, loudly, as if I were hard of hearing or mentally slow. Marcus leaned forward, his voice oozing with false reassurance. It's all boilerplate stuff, Eleanor. Just a formality to keep the house in the family, protect Dad's legacy, protect Frank's legacy. The audacity of it was breathtaking. I looked at the stack of papers, at their neat, legalistic font. Their entire world, their grand ambition was contained in that half-inch of paper. It was so small, so limited. I didn't reach for their papers. Instead, I opened my simple, worn leather handbag, the one Frank gave me for our 30th anniversary. From it, I took out a single, slim folder, bound in dark blue leather, with the Franklin Trust logo discreetly embossed in gold. I placed it on the table. Then, with a quiet, deliberate motion, I used my folder to gently push their thick stack of legal documents to the side. The soft scrape of paper on polished wood was the only sound in the room. Jessica frowned. Mom, what's that? These are the papers Mr. Gable needs you to sign. I looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time, I let the mask slip. The gentle, confused mother vanished, replaced by someone she had never met. "I know what they are, Jessica," I said, my voice as calm and cool as the marble in the lobby of Franklin Trust. "But there is another document that requires our immediate attention." I opened my folder. I didn't remove a stack of papers. I removed a single sheet. It was a simple letter, on heavy cream-colored bond, with the letterhead of Argent Capital. I slid it across the table, not to the lawyer, not to my daughter, but directly to Marcus. He stared at it, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. "Before I sign away my home," I said, my voice cutting through the stale air, "I believe you are entitled to see the revised quarterly statement for your company's primary creditor." The word creditor hung in the air. Jessica looked completely lost, turning from me to Marcus and back again. Marcus, however, went rigid. His smug, confident mask evaporated. He picked up the paper, his hand not quite steady. I watched his eyes scan the page. I watched the blood drain from his face, leaving a pale, clammy sheen under the fluorescent lights. I watched him read the paragraph detailing the status of his loan, the missed payments, the default clauses. And I watched his eyes finally land on the signature at the bottom of the page, the signature of the new head of the trust that held his entire future in its hands. Eleanor Vance. He looked up at me, his mouth slightly agape. The man who had called my life's work a wasted asset was now looking at me with pure, unadulterated terror. He was seeing me for the first time. "Mom, what is going on?" Jessica demanded, her voice sharp with confusion and fear. "What does your name have to do with Marcus's company?" I turned my gaze to my daughter. "Your husband's company, my dear, has been operating on borrowed money for a very long time," I explained, my voice flat and devoid of emotion. "It is deeply in debt to a private equity firm. As it turns out, my late husband, your father, was that firm's majority owner." I let that sink in. Mr. Gable's jaw was slack. Jessica just stared, uncomprehending. "And as the sole executor of his estate," I continued, my eyes locking with Marcus's, "that makes me your husband's banker." I paused, letting the silence stretch, letting the full weight of my next words gather force. "And Marcus," I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper, a blade of ice, "your loan is in default. I'm calling it due. All of it. Effective immediately." The words hung in the sterile air of the conference room, absolute and irreversible, like a judge's final sentence. For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Mr. Gable, the lawyer, looked like he'd been turned to stone, his mouth slightly open. Jessica was staring at me, her face a pale mask of utter disbelief, as if I'd suddenly started speaking in a foreign language. But Marcus? Marcus looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. Not the ghost of my late husband, but the ghost of his own future, a terrifying specter of failure and ruin. Then, the silence was shattered. Not by a voice, but by a sound. A frantic, insistent buzzing from the center of the table. It was Marcus's phone, vibrating against the polished wood. A text. Then another. And another. A flurry of them, one after another, like a frantic SOS signal from a sinking ship. The news was already spreading. The great man, the tech visionary, was discovering that the foundation of his entire world was made of sand, and the tide had just come in. He finally broke, his voice a ragged whisper. No, you can't be serious." He looked at me, his eyes wide with a desperate, pleading panic. The slick, confident dealmaker was gone, replaced by a terrified boy. "Eleanor, please, we're family. We can work this out. This is just a misunderstanding. I can get new investors. I can restructure the debt. Just give me an extension, 60 days. That's all I need." I looked at him. At this man who had planned to toss me into a sterile bungalow and bulldoze my life's work, and I felt nothing. Not pity, not anger, not even satisfaction, just a vast, cold emptiness. He wasn't pleading for his life, he was pleading for his lifestyle. "There will be no extension, Marcus," I said, my voice as flat and final as a line in an obituary. "The assets of Innovate Dynamics will be liquidated to settle the outstanding debt. It's all in the terms of the agreement you signed." "The agreement," he stammered, shaking his head. That was business." "Yes," I agreed. "It was, and this is too." His panic, finding no purchase on the smooth, hard surface of my resolve, began to curdle into a venomous rage. His head snapped toward Jessica, who was still frozen in shocked silence. His eyes, which had looked at her with such performative adoration just minutes before, were now filled with pure, undiluted contempt. "You," he hissed, his voice low and dangerous. "This is your fault." Jessica flinched as if he had struck her. "What? Marcus, I don't understand." "You were supposed to handle her," he snarled, jabbing a finger in my direction. "You told me she was a lonely, confused old woman. You said she was losing her mind, that she'd sign anything you put in front of her if you just cried a little. You said this house, this asset, was a sure thing." Every word was a confession of his scheme, of his contempt, and most of all, of the way he saw his own wife, not as a partner, but as a tool, an instrument to be used. I watched Jessica's face. It was a slow, painful awakening. The dawning horror in her eyes was terrible to behold. The man she loved, the man for whom she had betrayed her own mother, was revealing himself to be a complete stranger, a monster hiding behind a mask of ambition. The "we" he had always used, "we need a bigger house, we are worried about you," was a lie. It had never been we. It had only ever been him. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Stop it. Stop it," he laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "My life is over because you couldn't control your own mother. You failed. You failed me." He finally stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floor. He leaned across the table, his face contorted. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" I had seen enough. The unraveling was complete. I stood up, my movements calm and deliberate. I picked up my single blue leather folder, the only object on the table that held any real power. The thick stack of deed transfer papers sat there, forgotten, a tombstone for a dead future. I turned to their lawyer, who looked like he wished the floor would swallow him whole. "Mr. Gable," I said, my voice leaving no room for argument. "I believe our business here is concluded. My lawyer from Franklin Trust will be in touch with you and your client regarding the liquidation process." Marcus just stared at me, his chest heaving, his face slick with sweat. He had no more words, no more threats, no more bargains. He was empty, a hollowed-out shell of a man. I walked to the door. For a moment I considered looking back at my daughter, at the wreckage of the life she had chosen, but I didn't. Her path from this moment was her own to walk. I had simply cleared away the lies so she could see the road ahead. I opened the door and stepped out into the quiet hallway, leaving the three of them in the beige, silent room with the buzzing phone and the bitter taste of consequences. Justice, I realized, isn't a loud, triumphant celebration. Sometimes, it's just the quiet, final click of a closing door. Justice, I realized, isn't a loud, triumphant celebration. Sometimes it's just the quiet, final click of a closing door. After that door clicked shut, a profound silence descended. Not the heavy, grief-stricken silence that had followed Frank's death, but a clean, empty silence, the silence of a swept room, waiting to be filled with something new. In the weeks that followed, the shockwaves of that meeting rippled outward. I didn't have to do anything. The legal machinery I had set in motion did its work with cold, impersonal efficiency. I would hear snippets of news from my neighbor Brenda, who heard it from someone else at the grocery store. Marcus's company had collapsed overnight. His photo was in the local business journal, not as a visionary, but as a cautionary tale. Their minimalist gray house went on the market, its contents likely to be sold off to satisfy a fraction of his debts. I took no joy in it. It was simply the logical conclusion to a story he had written for himself. I didn't hear from Jessica. Not a call. Not a text. Part of me was relieved. The wound was too raw, too deep. But another part of me, the stubborn, irrational mother's heart, ached with a dull, constant pain. I had won the war, but the victory felt strangely hollow because my daughter had been a casualty. I spent most of my time in the garden. My hands, plunged into the rich, dark soil, felt more at home there than anywhere else. Tending to Frank's roses, nurturing new life from the earth, was the only thing that made sense. It was an act of faith, a belief that even after the harshest winter, things could grow again. It was on a bright, crisp autumn afternoon, about a month after the meeting, that I heard the old garden gate creak open. I didn't have to look up to know who it was. I kept my attention on the rose bush I was pruning, my shears making a sharp, clean snip as I removed a withered cane. She stood there for a long time, just inside the gate, as if uncertain she was allowed to walk on the grass. When I finally looked up, I was surprised by what I saw. The slick, confident woman from the lawyer's office was gone. In her place was a younger, rawer version of my daughter. She wore no makeup, her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she was dressed in jeans and a plain gray sweater that looked too big for her. She looked tired. She looked small. I turned back to my roses, my silence a wall she would have to choose to scale. "The roses look beautiful, Mom," she said, her voice quiet and rough, as if she hadn't used it much lately. I snipped another branch. "Your father had a knack for it," I replied, my voice neutral. She took a few hesitant steps closer, stopping by the old stone bird bath. "I went to see a lawyer," she said. "I've filed for divorce." I paused my work but didn't look at her. "I see. He said some terrible things," she continued, her gaze fixed on the ground. "After you left, he blamed me for everything, for not being smart enough, not being convincing enough, for being a disappointment." She looked up then, and her eyes were filled with a dawning, horrified clarity. He was just saying out loud what he'd been making me feel for years. I finally put the pruning shears down in my wicker basket and faced her. This was the moment of truth, an excuse, a justification, a single attempt to shift the blame, and the wall between us would become a permanent fortress. But the excuses never came. "He filled my head with so many ideas," she whispered, her hands twisting in front of her. "He convinced me that your love was a cage, that this house, our memories, they were all just things holding me back from some bigger, better life he had planned. He made me feel like if I didn't want what he wanted, there was something wrong with me." She took a shaky breath. "But he didn't force me, Mom. That's what I have to live with. He didn't force me to lie to you. He didn't force me to pack your life in a box." I did that. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. "It was easier to believe you were the problem than to admit I had married a man who was so empty, a man who looked at our family and just saw a balance sheet. I chose to believe him. Because I was a coward. I was so afraid he would leave me if I wasn't the person he wanted me to be, and I let that fear make me cruel to you, the only person who has ever loved me without an agenda." I watched her, this child of mine, as she stood in the wreckage of her life and took ownership of her part in the demolition. The anger I had held onto for so long, a hard protective shell around my heart, began to soften. "I started seeing a therapist," she said, wiping her cheek with the back of her hand. "She asked me what I actually wanted. For myself, and I realized I haven't known the answer to that for a very long time, but I know what I don't want. I don't want to be that person anymore. The person who could look at your face and not see your pain." She finally looked me square in the eye. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't think I deserve it. I wanted you to know that I see it now. I see everything." I walked over to the rose bush I had been working on. It was an old, stubborn variety Frank had loved, called Resurrection. It had nearly died one winter, but he'd pruned it back almost to the ground, and it had come back stronger than ever. I touched one of the new, deep crimson blooms. "You broke something, Jessica," I said softly, the words coming out without the sharp edge I had expected. "Something your father and I spent a lifetime building. An apology doesn't fix a break like that." Her face crumpled, and she nodded, accepting the truth of it. "I know," she whispered. "Trust isn't a gift," I continued, my gaze still on the rose. "It's a garden. You have to tend to it. You have to protect it from the cold. And when it's damaged, you have to have the patience to help it grow back. It takes time. It takes work." I turned to her then, and I saw not the betrayer, but my daughter, lost and broken, and for the first time in years, completely honest. "I don't know if we can fix this," I said, the words tasting of a painful truth. "But I know it can't be fixed with lies." She just nodded, tears streaming down her face now, but she made no move to come closer. She respected the space between us, the ground that had to be carefully, painstakingly cultivated again. And in that small act of respect, I saw the first, tiny, green shoot of a new beginning. That fragile shoot was something I knew couldn't be rushed. Like any good gardener, I knew it needed time, patience, and plenty of space to grow. Trust, once broken, doesn't mend overnight. It has to be rebuilt, slowly and quietly, one honest conversation and one kept promise at a time. 6 months later, the world had turned, and spring had returned to my garden. The afternoon sun streamed into Frank's study, illuminating not a shrine to the past, but a vibrant, active office. My office. The room was still filled with his books, but now they shared space with my own files, my laptop, and stacks of correspondence. The sad, heavy dust of grief had been replaced by the energetic hum of purpose. I was on the phone with the dean of the history department at the state university, the same one where Frank had taught for 30 years. "Yes, that's correct," I said, a smile in my voice. The endowment for the Frank Vance Memorial Scholarship should be finalized by the end of the week. I want to make sure the first recipient is chosen for the fall semester. After I hung up, I sat for a moment, looking out the window at the roses, which were just beginning to bud. Frank's legacy wouldn't be a cold, minimalist house built on a foundation of lies. It would be generations of students who shared his passion for the past, their futures made a little brighter by the quiet man who loved books. The door creaked open, and Jessica came in, holding 2 steaming mugs. She didn't have to ask if I wanted tea anymore, she just knew. She placed one on the desk beside me, the old Grand Canyon mug I'd rescued from the donate box. It was a small, silent acknowledgement of everything we had been through. "How was the call?" she asked, settling into the armchair opposite the desk, the one where Marcus had never once sat. "Good," I said. "Dean Albright is thrilled. He said Dad would be too." Jessica smiled. A real, gentle smile that reached her eyes. In the past few months, I had seen her more than I had in the past few years. She didn't come with grand apologies or dramatic pronouncements anymore. She came with groceries from Costco. She came to help me mulch the garden. She came sometimes, just to sit in the living room with me and watch old movies, the comfortable silence between us more meaningful than any words. She was rebuilding, brick by brick, not just her life, but the bridge back to me. She was tending the garden. Her eyes fell on the dark blue Franklin Trust portfolio that now sat on a corner of the desk. "It's still hard to believe," she murmured, shaking her head. "That Dad, that all of this was just sitting there, all that time. He wasn't a man who trusted banks more than he trusted books," I said. I think he built a fortress for us, but he was so busy building it, he forgot to give me the key." I looked at her, my daughter, who was slowly finding her way back to herself. Or maybe he knew I'd have to be strong enough to find it on my own. The truth is, the money was the least important thing Frank left me. The real inheritance was the journey I had to take to find it. I had to face my own fear, my own grief, and the deepest betrayal imaginable. I had to become the woman Marcus and Jessica had tried to erase. In their attempt to declare me incompetent, they had forced me to discover just how competent I truly was. They wanted to steal my house, but in the end, they gave me back myself, and that was a gift no amount of money could ever buy. I looked out at my home, at the sturdy walls that had held my story for so long. It wasn't a wasted asset, it was the foundation. Frank and I had written the first few chapters together, and for a while, I thought the story was over. But I was wrong. I was just starting a new section, a sequel written in my own hand. It would be a story about resilience, about the quiet strength of a woman who refused to be edited out of her own life, a story about a garden, and how sometimes the most beautiful blooms are the ones that grow back after the frost. What happened to me was a nightmare, but it taught me that your value isn't determined by your age, your bank account, or what other people think you're capable of. The greatest asset you can ever own is your own self-respect, a legacy you build for yourself every single day. So let me ask you, if you discovered you had a hidden strength you never knew about, would you have the courage to use it? If this story resonated with you, please let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to share this with someone who needs to be reminded that they are the most powerful character in their own story.